Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome back to this cozy corner of history where we explore the stories that time tried to bury. Tonight, we're journeying to a world where something as natural as reaching for a pencil with your left hand could transform a child's entire school experience into a daily nightmare of humiliation, pain, and forced transformation. Whether you're nestled under warm blankets ready to drift off to sleep, or simply seeking to unwind with some gentle historical storytelling, I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend this evening with me. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from tonight, and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always such a comfort to see our community of history enthusiasts gathered here from every corner of the globe. And if you find peace in these calm, immersive tales from ages past, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss our next journey together. But for now, let's allow the gentle weight of modern comfort to settle around you as we travel back to the cold stone corridors of a Victorian schoolhouse in Manchester, England, in the winter of 1885. Tonight, we're sitting beside a 7-year-old boy named Thomas as he faces his first day at the local board school, following a story that will remind us just how precious our modern understanding of human diversity truly is, how fortunate we are to live in a time when a child's natural handedness is celebrated rather than crushed. Picture yourself settling deeper into your pillow as we begin this tale of Thomas Whitmore, a blacksmith's son, bright-eyed and eager to learn, whose only crime was being born left-handed in a world that saw this natural trait as evidence of moral corruption that required violent correction. Close your eyes if you wish, and let your breathing slow as we explore together what it meant to be a left-handed child in an era when teachers believed they could literally beat the wrongness out of you. Take a deep breath with me now, feeling the softness of your bedding, the warmth of your room, the safety of your walls. Hold on to that comfort as we journey back 139 years to a world where such simple pleasures were denied to children whose only fault was reaching naturally with their left hand, where the very trait that modern science tells us indicates different brain organization was seen as a defect to be corrected through systematic torture, disguised as education. The November rain drums against the tall windows of the Manchester Board School as our story begins, and already we can sense the institutional coldness that permeates these walls like dampness seeping through stone. In your comfortable bed, surrounded by the knowledge that differences in handedness are understood as normal human variation, perhaps you can begin to understand why young Thomas's hand trembles as he clutches his slate pencil. Why his eyes fill with tears before the school day has even begun, and why his parents have warned him that he must learn to be normal or face consequences too terrible to imagine. Let your breathing synchronize with mine as we step into Thomas's world on this November morning in 1885, when the Industrial Revolution has transformed England but left behind rigid ideas about conformity and correctness that make any deviation from the norm a target for violent correction. The Manchester Board School stands as a monument to Victorian educational progress, a massive brick building with high windows designed to let in light while preventing students from seeing the world outside. A perfect metaphor for an educational system that claimed to enlighten while systematically crushing individual differences. Feel the weight of those institutional expectations as they press down upon young Thomas like the heavy wool coat his mother has wrapped around him. 7 years old, he has spent his short life naturally favoring his left hand for everything: eating, drawing, reaching for objects, and most recently, learning to write his letters on the slate his father purchased for his education. Contemporary records from Victorian Britain, including school punishment books and educational treatises, reveal that by the 1880s, the persecution of left-handed children had become not just accepted practice, but educational doctrine supported by medical and moral authorities. Rest comfortably in your safe bed as we witness how Thomas's condition has already been identified by his family as a source of shame and concern. Historical sources from this period, including the extensive documentation found in school punishment books from institutions like Nether Stowey School and various Manchester Board schools, show us that left-handedness was viewed not as a natural variation, but as a moral failing that required immediate correction. The prevailing Victorian belief held that left-handedness indicated weakness of character, potential mental deficiency, and even spiritual corruption that could spread to other children if left unchecked. Thomas's mother, Margaret Whitmore, had noticed her son's left-hand preference when he was barely 2 years old, watching with growing concern as he consistently reached for objects, held his spoon, and attempted to draw with his left hand. In Victorian society, this preference was immediately recognized as problematic. Many students were disciplined for using their left hand to write. Those who were left-handed were looked at as inferior to those who were right-handed. It was sometimes even believed that being left-handed was a curse. Margaret had consulted with neighbors, church officials, and eventually the local doctor, all of whom confirmed her fears that Thomas's left-hand preference required correction before it became permanently established. The attempts at home correction had begun when Thomas was 5 years old, with Margaret tying his left hand behind his back during meals and forcing him to use his right hand for all activities. Children weren't allowed to write with their left hand. It would be tied behind your back to stop you. The process proved frustrating and often heartbreaking, as Thomas struggled to perform simple tasks with his non-dominant hand, spilling food, dropping objects, and growing increasingly frustrated with his inability to control his movements naturally. Yet Margaret persisted, convinced that allowing her son to continue using his left hand would doom him to a life of social rejection and economic hardship. Feel the texture of rough hemp rope beneath your fingers as we imagine the restraints that Thomas learned to accept as normal parts of his daily routine. Unlike the comfortable clothes you wear without any constraint on your natural movements, Thomas's daily existence involved having his left hand bound behind his back for hours at a time, forcing him to develop coordination with his right hand through repetitive practice that left him exhausted and often in tears. The bindings caused pain and numbness, but Victorian parents and educators believed that such discomfort was necessary to prevent the greater suffering that would result from allowing left-handedness to persist. The medical establishment of the 1880s provided full support for these corrective measures. Physicians like Dr. James Crichton Browne, a prominent Victorian psychiatrist, published papers arguing that left-handedness indicated underdevelopment of the left hemisphere of the brain and could lead to mental instability if not corrected during childhood. These medical opinions gave scientific legitimacy to what was essentially systematic child abuse, transforming parental and educational cruelty into supposedly rational treatment for a diagnosed condition. The educational theories supporting left-hand suppression were equally elaborate and equally wrong. Victorian educators believed that allowing children to use their left hands would create confusion in their brain development, leading to difficulties with reading, writing, and mathematical reasoning. They argued that the natural bias toward right-handedness in human societies proved that left-handedness was an evolutionary throwback that modern education should eliminate through proper training. Most significantly, they claimed that left-handedness was contagious, that allowing one left-handed child to write naturally in a classroom would encourage other children to experiment with left-hand use, spreading the defect throughout the student population. These theories led to educational policies that required systematic identification and correction of left-handed tendencies in all students. Children were taught to write in a handwriting style called copperplate, and left-handed children were often forced to write with their right hands. Teachers received specific training in recognizing left-hand preference and implementing correction procedures. School inspectors evaluated institutions partly on their success in eliminating left-handedness among their students. The war against the left hand had become an integral part of Victorian education, supported by law, medicine, and social custom. As Thomas approaches his first day at the Manchester board school, he carries with him not just the normal anxieties of a young child entering formal education, but the specific terror of a left-handed child who knows that his natural inclinations will be met with systematic punishment. His parents have prepared him for what lies ahead, explaining that the teachers will help him overcome his weakness through methods that may seem harsh, but are necessary for his future success. Thomas doesn't understand why using his left hand feels wrong to adults when it feels so natural to him, but he has learned not to question the absolute authority of the grown-ups who control his world. The school building itself seems designed to intimidate children into conformity. The massive brick facade rises 4 stories above the Manchester streets, with windows placed high above the ground to prevent students from seeing out during lessons. The windows in a Victorian classroom were high up, to stop pupils looking out of the window, and the rooms were lit by gas lights. As a result, the schoolrooms were gloomy and often stuffy. The entrance hall displays portraits of Queen Victoria and various educational officials whose stern expressions seem to watch every movement of the children filing through the corridors. The very architecture communicates the message that individual desires and natural inclinations must be subordinated to institutional authority and social conformity. The classroom that Thomas enters represents the pinnacle of Victorian educational design, with tiered floors that allow the teacher to observe every student while maintaining physical and psychological dominance over the learning environment. The classrooms being like tiered lecture theatres, and the teacher's desk being high up, says a lot about the teaching methods. Children were expected to learn by being lectured at, although that term would not have been used, i.e. by having information fed into them as they sat passively to absorb it. The rows of wooden desks, designed specifically for right-handed students, create an immediate physical disadvantage for left-handed children who must contort their bodies to write properly. The teacher's elevated position allows constant surveillance of hand usage, ensuring that any left-handed tendencies will be immediately detected and corrected. Thomas takes his assigned seat in the 3rd row, surrounded by other working-class children whose parents have sacrificed to provide them with the opportunity for basic education. The wooden bench feels hard beneath him, and the attached desk surface extends only to the right side, forcing him to twist his body awkwardly to reach the writing area with his right hand. In this design, the desk is attached on the right side, offering an armrest for right-handed people to use while writing. In some of these desks, the writing surface does not extend fully to the left, necessitating a left-handed user to turn their body in order to write properly, sometimes causing back, neck, and shoulder problems. The design seems specifically calculated to make left-handed writing impossible, and Thomas realizes that even attempting to use his natural hand would immediately identify him as a problem requiring correction. Feel your heart rate slow to match Thomas's as he sits in terrified anticipation, while Mr. Edmund Hartwell, the schoolmaster, begins the morning lesson with an inspection designed to identify any students who might harbor left-handed tendencies. It is now December of 1885, and Thomas has survived several weeks at the Manchester board school, but each day brings new horrors as the systematic campaign against his natural-handedness intensifies with methods that would be recognized as torture if applied to adults, but are sanctioned as education when inflicted upon children. Mr. Hartwell represents the pinnacle of Victorian educational authority, a man in his 50s who has dedicated his career to molding working-class children into productive citizens through methods that emphasize discipline, conformity, and the suppression of any individual traits that might interfere with social order. Trained in the latest educational theories from London's teacher training colleges, he approaches the correction of left-handedness with the confidence of a man who believes he is saving children from lives of failure and social rejection. His methods, documented in school punishment books throughout England, represent the systematic application of psychological and physical torture to children whose only crime was being born with different brain organization. The morning inspection that Mr. Hartwell conducts reveals the sophisticated nature of Victorian efforts to detect and suppress left-handedness. Students are required to hold their hands out for examination, allowing the teacher to identify any calluses, ink stains, or other signs that might indicate secret left-hand use. They are then required to perform a series of tasks, picking up objects, pointing to items around the room, applauding the teacher, while Mr. Hartwell watches carefully for any child who shows natural left-hand preference. Amazingly, children were reprimanded for using their left hand to write. This was seen as a punishable offense, and they were made write with their right hand. The inspection creates an atmosphere of terror where children learn to suppress their natural impulses and monitor their own movements constantly to avoid triggering punishment. Thomas has learned to perform these inspections with his right hand, but the effort requires intense concentration that leaves him exhausted before the academic lessons even begin. He must consciously override his natural inclinations in every movement, transforming simple actions like reaching for a pencil or pointing to words on the blackboard into complex mental exercises that demand constant vigilance. The psychological strain of maintaining this deception grows heavier each day, but Thomas knows that discovery would bring consequences too terrible to contemplate. The writing lessons represent the most intensive phase of left-hand suppression, conducted with methods that combine physical restraint, psychological humiliation, and systematic pain to force children to abandon their natural handedness. Students identified as having left-handed tendencies are required to sit with their left hands tied behind their chairs during all writing activities, a practice that continues for hours at a time despite causing numbness, pain, and eventual injury to the restrained limb. Even during the 18th and 19th centuries, punishment meant tying a child's left hand behind a chair. The restraints used in Thomas's classroom consist of rough, hemp rope that chafes against his wrist and cuts off circulation when pulled tight. Mr. Hartwell personally ties each left-handed child to their chair at the beginning of writing lessons, pulling the rope tight enough to ensure that the hand cannot be moved, but not so tight as to cause immediate visible injury that might attract unwanted attention from school inspectors. The children are then required to complete hours of writing exercises using only their right hands, while their left hands gradually lose feeling and develop permanent nerve damage from prolonged restraint. The writing exercises themselves are designed to be as difficult and frustrating as possible for children forced to use their non-dominant hands. Students must copy complex passages from the blackboard using the elaborate copperplate handwriting style that requires precise control and fluid movement impossible to achieve with an unfamiliar hand. Children were taught to write in a handwriting style called copperplate, and left-handed children were often forced to write with their right hands. Any mistakes, smudges, or signs of difficulty are met with immediate punishment, creating a situation where left-handed children are systematically set up for failure and then punished for the inevitable results. Thomas struggles through these writing sessions with tears streaming down his face, not from sadness, but from the intense concentration required to control his unfamiliar right hand, while his left hand throbs with pain from its restraints. The letters he produces are shaky and uneven, bearing no resemblance to the elegant examples on the blackboard that serve as the standard for acceptable work. Each writing session leaves him with cramped fingers, an aching right arm, and a left hand that tingles with pins and needles as circulation slowly returns when the restraints are finally removed. The punishment for poor handwriting involves the systematic application of physical pain designed to create negative associations with left-hand use and positive reinforcement for right-hand compliance. Mr. Hartwell carries a birch cane specifically for correcting handwriting problems, and left-handed children receive regular beatings as part of their corrective therapy. It wasn't uncommon for children to be beat by canes made from birch wood. Boys were typically caned on their backsides, whereas girls would take the punishment on their legs or hands. The cane strikes are delivered to the child's left hand specifically, creating painful associations with the limb that teachers hope will discourage its future use. The psychological impact of these beatings extends far beyond the immediate physical pain. Thomas learns to flinch whenever he sees his left hand, developing an unconscious fear response to his own natural inclinations. He begins to experience nightmares about his left hand, dreams where it grows larger and more threatening, attacking him or betraying him to the authorities. The systematic torture transforms his relationship with his own body, creating lasting psychological damage that will affect his self-perception and confidence for the rest of his life. Between the writing lessons, Thomas faces additional challenges designed to reinforce right-hand dominance in every aspect of school life. Eating lunch requires using utensils with the right hand only, regardless of the difficulty this creates for left-handed children. Art lessons involve drawing and painting exercises that are graded partly on the child's ability to maintain proper right-hand form throughout the activity. Even recreational activities like clapping games and playground exercises are monitored to ensure that children maintain proper hand usage at all times. The social dynamics of the classroom create additional pressure on left-handed children to conform to right-hand expectations. Other students learn to identify and report left-hand usage as part of their civic duty, creating an atmosphere of mutual surveillance where children monitor each other's hand movements and compete to demonstrate their own conformity. Thomas discovers that former friends avoid him once his left-handed tendencies become known, fearing that association with a defective child might bring suspicion upon themselves. The isolation that results from this social rejection compounds the psychological damage of the physical torture. Thomas finds himself increasingly alone during recess periods, unable to participate in games that require coordination he cannot achieve with his forced right-hand dominance. His academic performance suffers as the mental energy required to suppress his natural handedness leaves him unable to concentrate on learning reading, arithmetic, and other subjects. The very education that was supposed to improve his life prospects becomes the mechanism through which his natural abilities are systematically destroyed. Most tragically, Thomas begins to internalize the Victorian beliefs about left-handedness that justify his torture. He starts to believe that there is something genuinely wrong with him, that his natural inclinations are evidence of moral weakness or mental deficiency that requires correction through suffering. The systematic nature of the abuse, supported by medical authority and social custom, makes it impossible for a 7-year-old child to recognize that he is the victim of institutionalized cruelty rather than a defective individual receiving necessary treatment. The winter months bring additional suffering as the cold Manchester weather makes the restraints even more painful and the hours of forced immobility even more torturous. Thomas's left hand develops chilblains and other cold-related injuries from poor circulation caused by the rope restraints, but these injuries are dismissed by teachers as natural consequences of his resistance to proper correction. The combination of physical pain, psychological pressure, and social isolation creates a perfect storm of childhood trauma that Victorian educators mistake for educational progress. Take a deeper breath now, dear listener, and feel the weight of your warm blankets as we follow Thomas through the darkest months of his Victorian education, when the systematic torture designed to suppress his left-handedness reaches its peak intensity and begins to produce the kind of psychological breakdown that Victorian educators interpreted as successful conversion. It is now March of 1886, and Thomas has endured 5 months of daily torture disguised as education, 5 months of systematic assault on his natural handedness that has left him physically injured, psychologically traumatized, and spiritually broken. The documentation from Victorian schools reveals that the process of correcting left-handedness typically reached its crisis point after several months of intensive intervention, when children either submitted completely to right-hand dominance or suffered psychological breakdowns that required different approaches. Right-handed adults forcing left-handed children to alter and reject their natural behavior led to the development of conditions such as stuttering and attention disorders. Thomas represents thousands of children who underwent this systematic destruction of their natural brain organization in the name of educational progress and social conformity. The physical damage from months of daily restraint has become severe enough to attract notice even from Victorian educators accustomed to inflicting pain on children. Thomas's left hand shows signs of permanent nerve damage, with reduced sensation in his fingers and occasional tremors that make fine motor control difficult even when he is allowed to use the hand. His wrist bears permanent scars from the rope restraints, and his shoulder has developed chronic pain from months of being forced into unnatural positions. Yet Mr. Hartwell interprets these injuries as evidence that the correction process is working, that Thomas's body is adapting to proper right-hand dominance. The psychological symptoms that Thomas displays would be recognized today as clear signs of trauma and abuse. But Victorian educators viewed them as natural stages in the conversion process that required continued application of corrective pressure. Thomas has developed a severe stutter that makes oral recitation nearly impossible, forcing him to struggle through simple sentences while his classmates watch in a mixture of pity and fear. Three famous examples are King George VI, who was forced to learn to write with his right hand and developed a stutter. This same pattern repeated in countless working-class children whose suffering went unrecorded in official histories. The stutter represents only the most visible manifestation of the psychological damage that months of systematic torture have inflicted upon Thomas's developing mind. He has begun to experience what would now be recognized as dissociative episodes, periods where he feels disconnected from his own body and unable to control his movements or speech. During writing lessons, he sometimes finds himself unable to remember how to hold a pencil or form letters, as if the months of forced practice with his right hand have somehow erased his natural knowledge of these basic skills. Sleep has become another battleground where Thomas's suppressed natural inclinations emerge to torment him. He suffers from recurring nightmares about his left hand, dreams where it grows monstrous and threatens to destroy everything he cares about. In other dreams, his left hand becomes detached from his body and follows him around the classroom, betraying his attempts to appear normal by writing or reaching for objects when he's not watching. These dreams reflect the deep psychological split that Victorian education has created between Thomas's natural self and the artificial persona he must maintain to survive in the school environment. The social consequences of his condition have expanded beyond the classroom to affect every aspect of Thomas's life. His father, William Whitmore, has become increasingly frustrated with his son's slow progress in overcoming his left-handedness, interpreting Thomas's continued struggles as evidence of stubbornness or willful defiance rather than the natural result of forcing a child to suppress his dominant brain hemisphere. The additional discipline that Thomas receives at home for his school difficulties creates a cycle of punishment that extends from morning until night, leaving him no safe space where he can simply exist without monitoring and correction. Margaret Whitmore, Thomas's mother, finds herself torn between maternal instinct and social pressure as she watches her son's obvious deterioration under the correction regimen. She notices his weight loss, his increasing withdrawal from family activities, and his obvious fear whenever school is mentioned. Yet the medical and educational authorities assure her that these symptoms are normal parts of the correction process, and that relaxing the pressure now would undo months of progress and condemn Thomas to a life of social rejection and economic failure. The classroom dynamics have evolved to make Thomas a cautionary example for other students about the importance of proper hand usage and social conformity. Mr. Hartwell regularly uses Thomas's struggles as teaching moments, pointing out his poor handwriting, his speech difficulties, and his obvious misery as examples of what happens to children who resist proper correction. These public humiliations serve multiple purposes. They provide negative reinforcement for Thomas's continued left-hand preferences, while demonstrating to other students the consequences of failing to conform to institutional expectations. The other children in Thomas's class have learned to view him as fundamentally different and potentially dangerous, a source of contamination that might spread left-handedness to them if they associate too closely with him. This social isolation becomes self-reinforcing as Thomas's obvious distress and strange behaviors confirm their belief that left-handedness is indeed a sign of mental deficiency or moral corruption. The playground games that once provided relief from classroom pressures now become additional sources of humiliation as Thomas's coordination problems make him unable to participate successfully in normal childhood activities. The academic consequences of the left-hand suppression campaign extend far beyond handwriting difficulties to affect every aspect of Thomas's educational progress. The mental energy required to constantly suppress his natural inclinations leaves him unable to concentrate on reading, arithmetic, or other subjects that should be forming the foundation of his education. His grades suffer accordingly, creating additional justification for increased punishment and correction that further damages his ability to learn and develop normally. Most tragically, Thomas begins to lose access to the natural creativity and intelligence that his left-handedness represents. Modern neuroscience understands that left-handed people often possess enhanced spatial reasoning, artistic ability, and creative thinking that result from their different brain organization. Victorian education systematically suppressed these gifts in the mistaken belief that conformity was more valuable than individual talent. Thomas stops drawing, stops asking questions, stops showing curiosity about the world around him as these natural expressions of his personality become associated with the pain and humiliation of correction. The spring months bring a new phase in Thomas's ordeal as Mr. Hartwell decides that more intensive intervention is required to complete the correction process. Thomas is now required to wear a special restraint device that keeps his left hand immobilized throughout the entire school day, not just during writing lessons. The device, made of leather and metal, straps around his wrist and connects to his belt, preventing any movement of his left arm while allowing his right hand to remain free for school activities. The restraint device represents the pinnacle of Victorian ingenuity applied to the suppression of natural human diversity. Designed by educational specialists and manufactured specifically for use in schools, it transforms the crude rope bindings used earlier into a sophisticated instrument of systematic oppression. The device causes constant discomfort and periodic sharp pain when Thomas moves incorrectly, serving as a continuous reminder of his supposed deficiency while preventing any possibility of natural left-hand use. The psychological impact of wearing this device extends beyond the physical discomfort to include a profound sense of being marked as fundamentally different and defective. Thomas becomes a walking advertisement for the consequences of left-handedness, his obvious restraint serving as a warning to other children about the importance of maintaining proper hand usage. The device makes normal childhood activities impossible. He cannot climb playground equipment, cannot carry books properly, cannot even dress himself completely without assistance. The final stage of Thomas's correction involves what Mr. Hartwell calls reconditioning therapy, a systematic program designed to create positive associations with right-hand use while strengthening the negative associations already created with left-hand movement. Thomas is required to spend additional hours after regular school sessions practicing right-hand activities under close supervision, repeating movements until they become automatic responses that override his natural inclinations. These reconditioning sessions take place in the empty classroom after other students have gone home, creating an atmosphere of isolation and concentration where Thomas's every movement can be monitored and corrected. He must practice handwriting for hours at a time, copy pages of text without making mistakes, and perform coordination exercises designed to strengthen his right hand while keeping his left hand completely immobilized. Any signs of fatigue, frustration, or resistance are met with immediate punishment that reinforces the lesson that compliance is the only acceptable response. The success of the reconditioning program is measured not by Thomas's happiness, health, or educational progress, but by his ability to suppress all visible signs of left-hand preference while performing school activities with apparent right-hand competence. Mr. Hartwell keeps detailed records of Thomas's progress, noting improvements in his handwriting speed, reductions in his attempts to use his left hand, and increases in his apparent acceptance of the correction process. These records will eventually be used to demonstrate the effectiveness of Victorian educational methods to school inspectors and teacher training institutions. By late spring of 1886, Thomas has achieved what Victorian educators consider a successful conversion from left-handedness to proper right-hand dominance. He writes with his right hand, eats with his right hand, and performs all school activities without showing visible signs of left-hand preference. His handwriting, while never achieving the elegance expected of naturally right-handed students, meets the minimum standards for acceptable work. His behavior shows the compliance and submission that Victorian teachers interpret as evidence of moral improvement and successful character development. Yet the cost of this success is visible to anyone who looks beyond the superficial achievements celebrated by the educational system. Thomas has lost weight, developed chronic health problems, and shows signs of psychological damage that will affect him for the rest of his life. His natural creativity and curiosity have been systematically suppressed in favor of mechanical compliance with institutional expectations. Most tragically, he has learned to hate the very aspects of himself that made him unique and potentially gifted, internalizing the Victorian belief that difference equals deficiency and that natural inclinations must be subordinated to social conformity. Rest more deeply into your pillows now, dear listener, and feel the safety of your modern world as we follow Thomas through the lasting consequences of his Victorian education, understanding that his story represents not just individual tragedy, but a systematic assault on human diversity that destroyed countless children's potential while masquerading as progress. It is now autumn of 1887, and Thomas, at age 9, shows all the outward signs of successful conversion from left-handedness that Victorian educators celebrate, yet carries within him psychological wounds that will shape the rest of his life in ways his teachers never considered or cared to understand. The physical symptoms of Thomas's successful conversion have become part of his permanent identity, visible reminders of the systematic torture he endured in the name of education and social conformity. His left hand shows clear signs of nerve damage from months of daily restraint, with reduced sensation in his fingertips and occasional tremors that make fine motor control difficult. The chronic pain in his left shoulder, caused by months of forced immobilization, has become a constant companion that will worsen as he ages and begins the physical labor expected of working-class men. Most visibly, the scars on his wrist from rope restraints serve as permanent evidence of the systematic abuse he suffered, though Victorian society interprets these marks as badges of honor representing his successful transformation. The neurological consequences of forcing a left-handed child to suppress his dominant brain hemisphere extend far beyond simple handwriting difficulties to affect virtually every aspect of cognitive function and personality development. Thomas's natural spatial reasoning abilities, typically enhanced in left-handed individuals, have been severely compromised by years of systematic suppression of the brain pathways that would normally process this information. His artistic abilities, once evident in early childhood drawings, have disappeared entirely as the creative centers of his brain learned to associate visual expression with pain and punishment. Most significantly, The forced conversion has created what modern neuroscience would recognize as a permanent state of cognitive conflict, where Thomas's brain constantly struggles between its natural organizational patterns and the artificial pathways imposed by Victorian education. This internal conflict manifests as chronic difficulty with concentration, persistent feelings of confusion and disorientation, and a general sense that his thoughts and movements require more effort than they should. Tasks that should be automatic now require conscious attention, leaving Thomas perpetually exhausted by activities that other people perform effortlessly. The psychological trauma of systematic suppression has created lasting changes in Thomas's personality and emotional development that Victorian educators never considered or understood. The confident, curious child who entered school at age 7 has been replaced by an anxious, withdrawn boy who approaches new situations with fear and automatically suppresses any impulses that might attract attention or correction. His natural enthusiasm for learning has been extinguished by years of associating education with pain, humiliation, and the constant threat of punishment for being himself. The speech difficulties that developed during his conversion process have become permanent features of Thomas's communication style, affecting not just his ability to speak clearly, but his willingness to participate in conversations or express his thoughts publicly. Right-handed adults forcing left-handed children to alter and reject their natural behavior led to the development of conditions such as stuttering and attention disorders. The stutter that emerged during his most intensive correction period has become worse rather than better over time, as the underlying neurological damage continues to affect the brain centers responsible for speech coordination. The social consequences of Thomas's conversion extend throughout his community as neighbors, relatives, and family friends observe his transformation and draw conclusions about the effectiveness of Victorian educational methods. Those who supported the correction process point to his apparent right-hand compliance as evidence that firm discipline and proper instruction can overcome any natural deficiency. They use Thomas's case to justify continued suppression of left-handedness in other children, arguing that his initial suffering was necessary to save him from a life of social rejection and economic failure. However, more observant community members notice the less visible costs of Thomas's conversion: his obvious anxiety, his reluctance to participate in social activities, his apparent loss of the creativity and intelligence that had marked his early childhood. These observers begin to question whether the cure might be worse than the supposed disease, though they rarely voice such doubts publicly in a society that places absolute faith in institutional authority and educational expertise. The family dynamics within the Whitmore household have been permanently altered by the systematic abuse Thomas endured in the name of his improvement. William Whitmore takes pride in his son's apparent success in overcoming his left-handed deficiency, viewing the conversion as evidence of proper parental discipline and educational investment. He regularly displays Thomas's right-handed handwriting to neighbors and relatives as proof that working-class children can be improved through proper correction, never recognizing the psychological destruction that underlies this superficial achievement. Margaret Whitmore struggles with growing doubts about the wisdom of the correction process as she watches her son's obvious unhappiness and withdrawal from family life. She notices that Thomas no longer plays spontaneously, no longer asks questions about the world around him, and no longer shows interest in activities that once brought him joy. Yet she cannot express these concerns without implicitly criticizing the educational and medical authorities who assured her that correction was necessary for Thomas's future success. The conflict between maternal instinct and social pressure creates lasting tension within the family that affects all relationships and decision-making. The economic consequences of Thomas's damaged development begin to manifest as he approaches the age when working-class children typically leave school to begin apprenticeships or manual labor. His coordination problems, caused by years of forced suppression of his dominant brain hemisphere, make him unsuitable for many types of skilled work that require fine motor control or spatial reasoning. The creative abilities that might have led to artistic or innovative pursuits have been systematically destroyed through years of associating such expressions with pain and punishment. Most tragically, the very education that was supposed to improve his economic prospects has left him with fewer opportunities than he might have had if his natural abilities had been allowed to develop. The apprenticeship process reveals the full extent of Thomas's damaged potential as master craftsmen observe his difficulties with tasks that should come naturally to a boy of his age and background. His handwriting, while technically proficient in the Victorian style, lacks the fluid precision needed for detailed record-keeping or technical drawing. His spatial reasoning problems make him unsuitable for carpentry, masonry, or other building trades that require the ability to visualize three-dimensional relationships. Most significantly, his obvious anxiety and fearfulness make him an unappealing apprentice to masters who expect confidence and initiative from young workers. The blacksmith trade that Thomas might have naturally inherited from his father becomes impossible due to the chronic pain in his left shoulder and the coordination problems caused by years of forced right-hand dominance. Blacksmithing requires the coordination of both hands working together in precise timing, with the dominant hand typically controlling the hammer, while the non-dominant hand positions the work and operates tools. Thomas's damaged left hand cannot perform these support functions reliably, while his forced right-hand dominance lacks the natural power and precision that the work demands. As Thomas reaches adolescence, the psychological consequences of his childhood torture begin to manifest in new and troubling ways that Victorian society has no framework for understanding or addressing. He develops what would now be recognized as chronic anxiety and depression, persistent feelings of worthlessness and self-doubt that affect every aspect of his personality and social relationships. The systematic destruction of his natural self-expression during his school years has left him unable to identify or pursue activities that might bring satisfaction or joy, creating a pattern of passive compliance that characterizes all his interactions with the world. The romantic and social relationships that typically develop during adolescence prove particularly challenging for Thomas, whose damaged self-esteem and obvious psychological problems make him an unattractive partner to young women of his social class. His speech difficulties create barriers to normal conversation, while his general anxiety and fearfulness suggest weakness and instability that working-class families cannot afford in potential husbands and fathers. The social isolation that began during his school correction process continues and deepens as he becomes increasingly cut off from normal community relationships. Most heartbreakingly, Thomas begins to understand that his childhood suffering was unnecessary and based on ignorance rather than medical necessity. As he encounters other left-handed individuals who manage to avoid Victorian correction programs, often because they attended different schools or grew up in families with more progressive attitudes, he realizes that his natural handedness was not the defect that educators claimed, but simply a normal variation that required no correction. This realization creates a deep anger and resentment that has no acceptable outlet in Victorian society, where questioning educational authority is considered evidence of moral corruption. The anger that Thomas feels toward the system that destroyed his childhood potential conflicts with the Victorian expectation that individuals should be grateful for the education and correction they received, regardless of its consequences. He cannot express his rage without appearing ungrateful for the sacrifices his parents made to provide his schooling, nor can he criticize the teachers and officials who implemented his torture without challenging the fundamental assumptions of Victorian educational progress. This suppressed anger becomes another source of psychological damage, creating internal conflicts that affect his mental health and social relationships throughout his adult life. The pattern of Thomas's experience repeats throughout Victorian England as thousands of left-handed children undergo similar systematic torture disguised as education and character development. The school punishment books from institutions across the country document case after case of children beaten, restrained, and psychologically broken for the crime of using their natural dominant hand. Historical records from 1904 to 1927 show that punishment for left-hand use continued well into the 20th century, with children receiving multiple canings specifically for this natural behavior. The broader social impact of Victorian left-hand suppression extends beyond individual suffering to represent a systematic assault on human neurodiversity that impoverished entire communities by destroying the unique talents and perspectives that left-handed individuals typically contribute to society. The spatial reasoning abilities, artistic talents, and innovative thinking patterns associated with left-handedness were systematically eliminated from working-class communities through educational policies that prioritized conformity over individual development. The economic and cultural losses from this systematic suppression cannot be calculated, but they represent a profound waste of human potential in the name of social control. The medical and educational authorities who designed and implemented Victorian left-hand suppression programs never conducted systematic studies of the long-term consequences of their interventions, focusing instead on immediate behavioral compliance that satisfied their theories about proper child development. They failed to recognize that forcing children to suppress their dominant brain hemisphere created lasting neurological damage that affected not just handwriting, but every aspect of cognitive function and emotional development. The absence of follow-up studies allowed these programs to continue for decades, despite mounting evidence of their harmful effects. The religious justifications for left-hand suppression reveal the deep-seated cultural fears and prejudices that motivated Victorian educational policy beyond simple medical ignorance. The association of left-handedness with moral corruption, spiritual weakness, and potential evil influence reflected broader anxieties about social control and individual conformity that characterized industrial society. In medieval times and well beyond, stern Catholics believed that being left-handed was a sign of the devil or witchcraft. These fears persisted into the Victorian era, providing moral justification for systematic child abuse disguised as character development. The international scope of left-hand suppression during the Victorian era demonstrates that this was not simply a British phenomenon, but part of a broader pattern of industrial societies attempting to standardize human behavior for economic and social efficiency. In many societies, left-handed people have been historically forced as children to use their right hands for tasks which they would naturally perform with the left, such as eating or writing. German schools used similar restraint and punishment systems. Japanese culture enforced right-hand compliance through family pressure, and American institutions adopted Victorian methods wholesale. The global nature of this oppression reveals how industrial capitalism created systematic pressure for human conformity that transcended national boundaries. The resistance movements that eventually challenged Victorian left-hand suppression emerged not from educational or medical authorities, but from individual families and communities who observed the obvious damage these programs caused to children they loved. Parents began refusing to allow their children to be restrained and beaten for natural-handedness, despite pressure from schools and social services. Teachers who witnessed the psychological destruction caused by correction programs began quietly allowing left-handed children to write naturally, despite official policies requiring intervention. These small acts of resistance eventually coalesced into broader movements for educational reform and child protection. The scientific evidence that eventually vindicated left-handed individuals and condemned Victorian suppression programs came from emerging fields of neurology and psychology that Victorian educators had ignored in favor of behavioral theories based on social conformity rather than biological reality. Research into brain hemisphere specialization revealed that handedness reflects fundamental differences in neural organization that cannot be changed through external pressure without causing permanent damage. Studies of learning disabilities showed clear connections between forced handedness conversion and speech problems, coordination difficulties, and various forms of cognitive impairment. The legal and social reforms that eventually ended systematic left-hand suppression in schools required decades of advocacy by medical professionals, educational reformers, and families who had witnessed the damage these programs caused. The gradual recognition that children had rights to physical safety and psychological integrity that superseded institutional authority to enforce conformity represented a fundamental shift in social attitudes toward individual difference and educational purpose. The abolition of corporal punishment in schools, the development of special education programs for children with learning differences, and the emergence of child protection services all contributed to creating safer environments where natural handedness could be accepted rather than corrected. As we return from Thomas's tragic world to the comfort of your modern surroundings, perhaps we can carry with us something more than just another historical tale to ease us into sleep. Thomas's story speaks across 139 years to remind us that the distance between their systematic torture and our acceptance of human diversity reflects not inevitable progress, but specific choices made by countless individuals who decided that understanding matters more than conformity, that scientific evidence should guide educational policy rather than cultural prejudice, and that children's natural development deserves protection rather than violent correction. The modern understanding of handedness that has vindicated millions of left-handed individuals like Thomas rests on solid neuroscientific evidence that was completely unknown to Victorian educators. We now know that handedness reflects differences in brain hemisphere organization that begin developing before birth and cannot be changed through external intervention without causing permanent neurological damage. The approximately 10 to 13% of the population that shows left-hand preference possesses brain structures that often enhance spatial reasoning, creative thinking, and innovative problem-solving abilities that benefit entire societies when allowed to develop naturally. The research that has documented the lasting harm caused by forced handedness conversion provides clear evidence that Victorian suppression programs caused exactly the kinds of damage that families like the Whitmores observed in their children. Studies of individuals who underwent childhood handedness correction show significantly higher rates of speech disorders, learning disabilities, anxiety disorders, and various forms of psychological trauma that persist throughout their lives. The economic costs of this systematic damage, including reduced educational achievement, limited career opportunities, and increased healthcare needs, far exceed any theoretical benefits that Victorian educators imagined they were creating. Contemporary educational approaches to handedness differences demonstrate how far we have progressed from Victorian ignorance while revealing how much work remains to create truly inclusive learning environments. Modern schools provide left-handed students with appropriate tools, seating arrangements, and instructional modifications that support natural development rather than forcing conformity. Teachers receive training in recognizing and accommodating learning differences that would have been considered defects requiring correction in Thomas's time. Most importantly, educational philosophy has shifted from emphasizing behavioral compliance to supporting individual potential and recognizing diversity as a source of strength rather than a problem requiring solution. Yet Thomas's story also challenges us to recognize the ways that pressure for conformity and systematic suppression of individual differences continue in various forms within our contemporary world. While we no longer tie children's hands behind chairs for using their natural handedness, modern educational and social systems still create pressures for standardization that can damage children whose learning styles, social behaviors, or personal characteristics differ from institutional expectations. The tendency to pathologize normal human variation, to seek medical or behavioral interventions for differences that require accommodation rather than correction, and to prioritize institutional convenience over individual development reflects the same underlying attitudes that justified Victorian left-hand suppression. The broader lessons of Victorian-handedness persecution extend beyond educational policy to illuminate the ways that systematic oppression often masquerades as scientific progress and benevolent intervention. The medical authorities who provided scientific justification for child torture, the educational experts who designed systematic programs of abuse, and the social leaders who implemented policies of conformity all believed they were improving society and helping children overcome natural disadvantages. Their confidence in their own expertise, their dismissal of evidence that contradicted their theories, and their willingness to inflict suffering in pursuit of abstract ideals represent patterns of institutional behavior that persist in various forms throughout human societies. The courage required to resist systematic oppression, even when it is sanctioned by educational, medical, and social authorities, becomes clear when we consider the pressure that families faced to participate in their children's abuse. Parents like Margaret Whitmore, who questioned the wisdom of left-hand suppression, faced accusations of interfering with their children's education and future success. Teachers who refused to implement correction programs risked losing their positions and professional standing. Community members who criticized institutional policies were dismissed as ignorant or sentimental. The social mechanisms that maintained Victorian-handedness. Persecution demonstrate how oppressive systems protect themselves by making resistance appear irrational or harmful. The importance of listening to children's experiences rather than dismissing their complaints as evidence of weakness or resistance becomes apparent when we recognize that Thomas and thousands of other left-handed children clearly communicated their suffering to adults who chose to interpret pain as progress. The tears, the obvious distress, the deteriorating health, and the behavioral changes that accompanied handedness correction were visible to everyone involved, but were consistently reinterpreted as necessary stages in successful treatment rather than warning signs of systematic abuse. The willingness to prioritize adult theories over children's lived experiences represents a form of institutional blindness that enables continued harm while preventing the kind of feedback that might lead to policy changes. The role of individual action in creating social change illuminates both the possibility and the necessity of personal resistance to systematic oppression. The teachers who quietly allowed left-handed children to write naturally, the parents who refused to send their children to schools that practiced handedness correction, and the community members who spoke out against institutional abuse all contributed to the eventual end of Victorian suppression programs. Their actions demonstrate that social change often begins with individuals who choose to prioritize human dignity over institutional authority, even when such choices involve personal risk and social disapproval. The connection between Thomas's individual suffering and the broader patterns of social oppression that characterized industrial capitalism reveals how seemingly minor educational policies can serve larger systems of control and conformity. The systematic suppression of left-handedness was part of a broader effort to create standardized workers who would fit efficiently into industrial production systems that prioritized uniformity over creativity, compliance over innovation, and institutional authority over individual development. The damage done to left-handed children served the larger purpose of demonstrating to all children that natural inclinations must be subordinated to social and economic requirements regardless of personal cost. The persistence of handedness-related discrimination in various forms throughout the 20th and into the 21st century reminds us that the victory over Victorian suppression programs was incomplete and requires continued vigilance to maintain. While children are no longer beaten for left-hand use, many educational and social environments still create disadvantages for left-handed individuals through designs, procedures, and expectations that assume right-hand dominance. The tools, furniture, and spatial arrangements that characterize most learning and working environments continue to reflect the same assumption of uniformity that motivated Victorian correction programs, creating ongoing challenges for the approximately 10% of the population that learns and works differently. The evolution of our understanding of neurodiversity, the recognition that natural variations in brain organization and function represent valuable forms of human difference rather than defects requiring correction, owes much to the historical lessons learned from systematic programs like Victorian handedness suppression. The awareness that forcing conformity on naturally different individuals causes more harm than benefit has informed modern approaches to autism, dyslexia, ADHD, and various other forms of cognitive and behavioral difference. Yet the temptation to seek medical or behavioral interventions that will make different children appear more normal continues to challenge parents, educators, and healthcare providers who must balance acceptance of natural variation with provision of appropriate support. The economic and social benefits that societies gain from accepting and supporting neurodiversity become clear when we consider the innovations, artistic achievements, and problem-solving contributions that left-handed individuals have made when allowed to develop their natural abilities. The spatial reasoning skills that often accompany left-handedness have contributed to advances in architecture, engineering, and various visual arts. The creative thinking patterns associated with different brain organization have fostered innovations in technology, science, and cultural expression. The systematic suppression of these abilities through Victorian correction programs represents not just individual tragedy, but collective impoverishment that damaged entire societies' capacity for progress and creativity. The international scope of handedness discrimination throughout history demonstrates that this oppression transcended national boundaries and cultural differences, suggesting that the pressures for conformity and control that motivated Victorian programs represent universal human tendencies that require constant vigilance to prevent. The recent recognition that similar suppression programs continued in various countries well into the late 20th century, with reports of left-hand suppression in schools continuing into the 1980s and 1990s in some locations, reveals that the victory over this form of systematic abuse is more recent and less complete than many people assume. The courage and resilience demonstrated by individuals like Thomas, who survived systematic oppression while maintaining their essential humanity, provides inspiration for continued advocacy on behalf of all children who face pressure to suppress their natural characteristics in favor of institutional expectations. Thomas's ability to preserve some sense of self despite years of systematic assault on his identity demonstrates the remarkable strength of human individuality even under the most oppressive conditions. His story reminds us that behind every statistic about educational abuse or social oppression are real people whose suffering demands acknowledgement and whose survival represents triumph over systematic attempts to destroy their humanity. The responsibility that modern societies bear for preventing similar systematic oppression requires not just passive tolerance of individual differences, but active creation of environments where diverse forms of human potential can flourish. The recognition that left-handedness represents a valuable form of neurodiversity rather than a defect to be corrected challenges us to examine other areas where pressure for conformity might be preventing individuals from developing their natural abilities. The educational, social, and economic systems that we create either support or suppress human diversity, and the choice between these approaches determines whether future generations will benefit from the full range of human potential or suffer from systematic attempts to enforce artificial uniformity. Sleep now, dear listener, and remember that Thomas's legacy lives on in every left-handed child who can write naturally without fear, in every educational system that accommodates rather than corrects individual differences, and in every society that has learned to value diversity over conformity. Until we meet again in another quiet corner of history, may your dreams carry the understanding that our acceptance of human differences represents not weakness, but wisdom. that educational systems should serve individual development rather than institutional convenience, and that the courage to resist systematic oppression often begins with simply allowing children to be themselves. If you found comfort in this journey through history's shadows, please consider subscribing to join our community of gentle souls who believe the most important stories are often the hardest ones to hear. Like and share if this tale has touched your heart, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. There's something magical about knowing our little corner of history reaches around the world to bring people together in understanding and compassion. Good night, and may your sleep be as peaceful as the rest Thomas finally found when his suffering ended, and as hopeful as the world we've built where his story serves as reminder rather than prophecy, where children's natural handedness is celebrated rather than corrected, and where difference is recognized as a gift rather than a defect to be eliminated through systematic torture disguised as education.